Hey, everybody. Today, welcome to our interview sessions for the Bellevue Democrats. Today, I have Beth Roth with us. She is among other things, the legislative assistant to Senator Heidi Campbell. So she is right in the middle of our legislature each year, talking to people. And she has also been a staunch uh, gun law advocate, and has been working in that for a long time. And today we're going to talk about gun violence, what's causing this, how it's the laws have just gotten out of hand, and she's going to tell us some ways we can look at it and things we can hopefully do about it. And I'll go ahead and let Beth talk, and we're going to go through some slides with her, and she can explain these. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's great to be here. Thank you so much, Lee, for the opportunity. As you mentioned in your introduction, I do work with Senator Campbell now, but before working for her, I spent the last 5 or 6 years doing firearm policy advocacy and research. So I have learned quite a bit about the issue of gun violence in our state, and the best policies when it comes to gun violence prevention. So I thought it'd be helpful just to kind of walk through some slides. So Tennessee has a real problem with gun violence. In fact, it would be accurate to say that we have one of the worst gun violence problems in the entire country. What you see on this slide is that we are currently ranked 12th for firearm mortality for all intents. So firearm mortality is going to be any type of firearm death. So a homicide, a suicide, an unintentional shooting. The homicides could be, through the commission of a crime. It could be a domestic violence shooting or whatever. So 12th for all firearm mortality. 966 Tennesseans were killed with guns, by guns in 2009. And in 2019, the last year for which we have data, all this data is from the CDC, by the way. So 966 deaths in 2009. In 2019, the number was up to 1,270. And although we don't have 2020 numbers yet, we know that 2020 was a terrible year for gun violence across the country and here in Tennessee. So those numbers are only going to go up. Gun deaths, just looking at the last decade, gun deaths increased 22% from 2009 to 2019. So what you see on this chart is the red line is firearm mortality in Tennessee, and the gray dotted line is firearm mortality across the United States. So these are rates of firearm mortality. So this is deaths per 100,000. So you can see that Tennessee has consistently outpaced the rest of the country. The list of states over here on the right. This is the ranking of states for firearm mortality. It's the top 25. You'll see we come in at 12th. What is also interesting is every state that is in red are permitless carry states. So as you probably are aware, we passed a law this year against the recommendation of law enforcement, of district attorneys, and really the general public. Literally no one wanted this permitless carry law except for the NRA and some extremist legislators. We didn't want it for a variety of reasons. The first and foremost one being that states that have permitless carry laws tend to see higher rates of gun death. And as you can see in those 25, there are a lot of permitless carry states represented there. So this next slide is firearm homicide. So a homicide is going to be any type of intentional death with a gun. So again, in Tennessee, that could be everything from people getting into an argument and settling it with a gun, to a domestic violence shooting, to the shooting having something to do with the commission of a crime and a robbery or what have you. Tennessee is 9th in the country for firearm homicide. 3 of our largest cities broke homicide records over the last couple of years. Memphis, Knoxville, and Nashville have all broken homicide records in the last 4 or 5 years. Gun homicides increased 32% from 2009 to 2019. So again, you see the chart. Tennessee is represented in red. The dotted line is the rest of the country. So you can see how far we outpace the average. And again, the chart on the right is the ranking of states by the homicide rate. You see that we're ninth. And again, you see that a lot of the states in that top 25 are states that do not require gun permits. Firearm suicide is a huge issue in Tennessee as well as across the country. In fact, about 2/3 of all gun deaths nationally, and it comes out to about that same percentage in Tennessee, about 2/3 of gun deaths are firearm suicides. Firearm suicides are unique in both their impulsivity and their lethality, meaning that it takes very little planning to kill yourself with a gun, and firearm suicides are almost always successful, which is sort of it sounds terrible, but that's the term that you use, meaning that you very rarely survive a suicide attempt with a gun, unlike other suicide attempts, such as overdosing on pills or what have you. The research also shows that most people who attempt suicide and are unsuccessful in completing the suicide, most people do not attempt suicide again, which just emphasizes the point that means matter, meaning the way that you try to kill yourself matters, and why it's so important to make sure that people who are experiencing suicidal ideation do not have access to firearms. So you see the same charts. Tennessee, there in red, far ahead of the U.S. average, and then you see again we are ranked 17th. And once again, you see that the states that have loose gun laws, that have done away with their permitting system, have much higher rates of firearm suicide than those who didn't. So another real problem that we have in Tennessee is youth gun violence. So what we have here is some more statistics. We are 12th in the country for youth firearm mortality. Youth gun deaths increased 45% from 2009 to 2019. We average about 2 youth gun deaths every single week. So youth is considered 0 to age 19. So on any given week, there are about 2 of our young people who die because of a shooting. Youth firearm homicides, we're 8th in the country for youth firearm homicide, 8th out of the entire country. Our youth gun homicides increased 36% from 2009 to 2019. And on average, about one young person in Tennessee each week will be killed with a gun. Youth firearm suicide is a growing problem in our state. We're 22nd for youth firearm homicide. Youth gun suicides increased 58% in the decade between 2009 and 2019. So we average about 2 youth gun suicides every single month. And, again, one of the things that we talk about quite a bit is the importance of safe storage of firearms, because most of these young people who are using guns to take their own lives are using an unsecured gun that they get access to in their homes. So those numbers are pretty staggering. Another big problem we have in Tennessee are domestic violence shootings. So this data is actually from the FBI supplemental homicide reports. The Violence Policy Center does an analysis every year and puts out a report called Women Murdered by Men. Tennessee is currently ranked 9th for women murdered by men. The majority are killed with guns, and they are almost always killed by a current or former intimate partner. So this sort of red herring that you hear all the time, that women are just being attacked by strangers and shot by strangers, is just not borne out by the facts. Almost every woman who is murdered by a man is murdered by a man with whom she has a current or former relationship. And Tennessee has consistently ranked in the top 10 states for women murdered by men over the last decade. some years we are as high as fifth in the country. We're currently ninth, but those numbers are horrible, and it really makes Tennessee a very unsafe place to live if you're a woman, because we have such a proliferation of guns in our state. And just, just in general, a fact to be aware of is that the presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. So in other words, if a woman is living in a home or in an environment with an abusive partner, and there is a gun present, her likelihood of being murdered with that gun goes up 500%. Um, so you would think in a perfect world with the gun violence problem that we have, that we would have a legislature that is responsive to those issues and would take steps to address them. Unfortunately, that is not the state that we live in. So despite these horrible numbers, what we see is that over the last decade or so, we have passed a string of really bad legislation. Most recently, we passed the permitless carry law, which says that anyone who is quote unquote a lawful gun owner, meaning not prohibited from having a gun, anyone can carry that gun anywhere in public where guns are allowed without having to have any type of permit. The permitting system required permit applicants to undergo a background check to make sure that they were not prohibited from having guns, and it also required them to undergo at least some level of training. It used to be, to have a permit in Tennessee, you had to take an 8-hour class, 4 hours of which was range training. So you had to prove that you had at least some level of proficiency with a gun. We did away with that hard requirement by passing permitless carry. Another thing that's important to realize about permitless carry is passage of that law now means that even if a law enforcement officer sees someone open carrying a gun, they are now not allowed to ask that person if they're in lawful possession of the firearm. When we had before permitless carry, if an officer saw somebody with a gun sticking out of their pants or sticking out of their waistband of the pants, the policeman could go up to the person and ask them if they have a permit to carry. Now, because we no longer require permits, they are not able to do that, which was one of the big objectives that police had, was the number of people who were in fact not lawfully carrying guns that they were able to stop, because they could ask them if they were carrying a permit or not. That's been taken away. And we also, if you see someone carrying a gun in public, not only do you not know if they have any training, you don't even know if they underwent a background check in order to be carrying that gun or to have purchased it. So it creates all kinds of problems. Year before last, we passed a law to reduce the amount of training that you had to get a permit, from an 8-hour class to just watching I think 30-minute video online. Again, that was legislation that was opposed by law enforcement. It was actually both the permitless carry and the reduced training. Not only were those opposed by law enforcement, they were largely opposed by responsible gun owners, including those who teach firearm safety classes, who testified about the number of individuals that they had trained who, prior to that training, had no understanding whatsoever about how guns operate or the safe handling of guns. So that was passed a couple of years ago. We also passed a bill that allows you to carry guns on public transportation. So, in the state of Tennessee, you can carry a gun on an MTA bus. That was especially concerning to a lot of schools whose students use buses. In fact, my own son, who went to Megs and graduated from HUMFOG, used public transport. So you basically have people who may or may not have any training or ability or skill with a gun carrying a gun on a bus that may or may not have school children on it. We passed a law several years ago to allow people to carry guns in parks, including those that are adjacent to and used by schools. And then we also passed a law a couple of years ago to allow guns to be carried on college campuses by full-time faculty members and professors and full-time employees. As of right now, you still have to have a permit to carry on college campuses, and that does only apply to employees and faculty. However, it is very likely that in the next year or so, they will try and extend that to allow for students to carry guns on campus as well. In that same time that all of these bad bills were passed, we really missed opportunities to pass what could have been bills that could have saved lives and reduced gun violence. One piece of legislation that we have not passed is stronger dispossession laws for domestic abusers. And what that means is in Tennessee, it's under state and federal law. If you're convicted of a domestic violence offense, you're required to dispossess your firearms, meaning to get rid of them. Tennessee is one of 13 states that allows for what's called third party dispossession, which means in Tennessee, if you are no longer allowed to have a gun, you can surrender it to law enforcement. You can sell it to a licensed dealer, or you can just give it to a third party. Of the 13 states that allow third party dispossession, Tennessee is the only state that does not require any information about the third party be submitted to the court. So there is no way to know that that third party does not cohabitate with the abuser, is themselves not prohibited from having guns, that they understand that the offender is not allowed to have the guns back. We tried to pass legislation a couple of years ago that just would have required that third party to submit an affidavit to the court acknowledging receipt of the firearms and that they could that they were lawfully allowed to have guns. And that bill actually failed in the Senate for lack of a second. They wouldn't even hear the arguments for that bill because the NRA opposed it. We have tried to get child access prevention laws passed. Child access prevention laws would hold an adult gun owner responsible if they made the irresponsible choice to leave a gun accessible to children and a child picked the gun up and shot themselves or someone else with it. They have refused to pass that legislation. Extreme risk protection orders, which are modeled after our current orders of protection, allow someone who believes an immediate family member of theirs is an imminent risk to themselves or others, it would allow that family member to petition a judge to temporarily remove firearms from that person's possession. There have been a number of instances where a mass shooter has displayed certain behaviors that were very concerning to their loved ones, and their loved ones have asked them to get rid of the guns, and the shooter refused. And under the current law in Tennessee, there is no recourse if you're in a situation like that. Now, people throw around extreme risk protection orders, ERPOs is what we call. They're used often in the context of trying to prevent mass shootings, but really where they're most useful is trying to prevent firearm suicide. So if you're in a situation where a loved one who is a family member is depressed, is saying things that make you think that they may be considering suicide, maybe they're drinking a lot, using drugs, expressing suicidal ideation. Right now in Tennessee, there's absolutely nothing that you can do to remove firearms from that person. ERPOs allow those firearms to be temporarily removed from that person just for a finite amount of time, hopefully until whatever episode they're going through passes, at which time they get their guns and their right to own those guns back. We've also tried to prohibit transfer of guns to felons and domestic abusers. Right now, under Tennessee state law, it is not expressly written out in our code that it is illegal to give guns to a person who is prohibited from having them. So in other words, if I have a gun and you, Lee, are prohibited from having guns, if I say to you, hey, I have this gun, I don't need it anymore, would you like it? And you say, sure, I'll take that gun. You taking that gun would be violating the law. Me transferring that gun to you would not be a violation of the law, which seems ridiculous. A couple of years ago, they did pass legislation that prohibits transfer of guns to a person who's been adjudicated mentally ill, which is great. Adjudicated mentally ill means basically involuntarily committed. which, by the way, there are not tons of people who are involuntarily committed. However, there are lots of people in our state who are felons and who do have records of domestic abuse. So we think that that should be illegal. One of the other things that we have not done these last couple of years, although there's a lot of attention being paid to this now, especially now, which is funding for violence intervention programs. So there are a lot of groups that work within communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence that do what we would call the real boots on the ground work to interact with the young people in those communities, to work with the schools, the teachers, to talk about, trauma informed education, understanding what's going on with a lot of these students, and to hopefully connect them with resources that prevent them from ever getting into a situation where they're turning to guns or any type of violent means to solve their problems. A lot of these violence intervention programs, Cure Violence is probably the most known one. It was actually started by an epidemiologist out of Chicago that really said that the way to address violence is to treat it like a disease. So to kind of understand the root causes of it, where it is most localized, and try and contain it. Those programs have been extraordinarily successful. The data proves that they work. And the last couple of years, Senator Yarborough and Representative Love have carried legislation that would create funding mechanisms for those groups, and those unfortunately have not advanced, but we'll continue to push for them. And then, of course, just universal background checks for guns. So, as it is now, anybody who buys a gun from a licensed dealer, which means, if you go to, a sporting goods store, or you go to a gun show and buy from a licensed dealer, a vendor, you have to undergo a background check. However, if you want to buy a gun through some type of online gun exchange like armslist.com, or a Facebook group that operates more like kind of a swap meet, you're not required to undergo a background check to get a gun in that way. And of course, we and something like 94-95% of Americans, and really an overwhelming majority, depending on the polling, somewhere in the 70s and 80% range here in Tennessee, favor expanded background checks. So those are opportunities that we missed. Now, probably one of the worst gun laws that we ever passed in Tennessee was the Guns and Trunks bill. That was the first version of it, was passed in 2013 and applied just to permit holders, and then they expanded it to 2014 for any gun owner. And basically, what it says is that you are allowed to store a firearm in your vehicle, even if your vehicle is parked on property that prohibits guns. So when that law was first introduced, there was a lot of opposition to it. Law enforcement had problems with it, but really the loudest opposition came from the business community that felt that their property rights were being usurped by this legislation. If I'm a business owner and I want to have certain rules about who can and can't carry guns on my property, as the business owner, I should be able to enforce those rules. And this legislation took that away from them. When that happened, the woman who was at the time the GOP caucus chair, she had an A+ rating with the NRA, was very powerful in Republican politics. Her name was Deborah Maggart, and she found herself sort of between a rock and a hard place. She had the gun rights and the NRA folks telling her she needed to vote for the legislation, but the business community was vehement in their opposition to it. Ultimately, she sided with them. The NRA then went on to spend over $150,000 to run someone against her in her primary. So you've heard the term being primaried. In Tennessee, in the legislature at least, to this day, they refer to it as being Maggartized. And that is why the NRA is able to get the legislation passed that they do up here. People assume that the NRA gives money to all these politicians, and they really don't. I mean, they give them maybe $500 here, maybe $1,000 there. What they really use as leverage is this threat of being Maggartized. It's really almost like it's like extortion, honestly. It reminds me a bit of how gangs operate, where you kind of pay protection money so that your candy shop doesn't get blown up. It's just in this case, the currency is supporting NRA-backed legislation. You see this billboard was actually put up in Goodlettsville during the primary where they equated Deborah Maggart with President Obama, which, I mean, if you knew Representative Maggart, I mean, that's just completely, utterly ridiculous. But it was effective and she lost her race. And so, you know, that's unfortunately how the operates. Now, why that's important, there's a couple of reasons why it's important. Number one, just to kind of give you an eye into how the NRA accomplishes their goals. But it's also really important to understand that's also how very bad policy gets passed, because since that legislation was passed, theft of guns out of vehicles has absolutely skyrocketed across the state. You see gun thefts from cars in Nashville from 2013 to 2020 has gone up 354%. There were 185 guns stolen out of cars in 2013. In 2020, the number was 839. The same in Memphis, the numbers have gone up substantially. They've gone up 278%. Now, in that exact same time period, what you see is the homicide numbers have gone up. So you see in Memphis, the number of guns stolen out of cars has gone up dramatically. And you also see that correlates with the number of homicides. And the same is true in Nashville, which is why to this day, if you talk to law enforcement, they uniformly condemn this law every year. Law enforcement, especially Memphis police, the Memphis police chief has consistently lobbied to repeal that bill, or to at the very least hold the gun owners responsible if they leave their guns in their cars. Because here's the thing, the majority of the guns that are stolen out of cars are stolen from unlocked vehicles. So these are not people bashing windows in with a crowbar and then, you know, prying open a glove box. These are literally young people. It's predominantly young people just walking through parking lots and just checking door handles, or just looking through the window and seeing a handgun. The police tell me that the majority of guns are left wedged in between the driver's seat and the console, or they are in the cup holder of the console. So something that anyone can easily see. Now, what's fascinating is the way that bill is written, the way that it was originally written, and the way that it is currently in the code. It says that gun owners may store their guns in their vehicle as long as the gun is secured in a locked vehicle and kept from ordinary view. Now, the thing is, there is no consequence written into the law for those gun owners who violate that part of the law. So that is an ongoing problem, and one that really has very clearly contributed to the staggering increase in gun violence we see across the state. Some main policies, you know, I don't like to just be doom and gloom. I like to talk about what solutions are. So you know, policies that we know work and are effective, investing in intervention, as we were talking about before, funding for violence interruption programs. Now, something that is really exciting is that last week, President Biden unveiled sort of his plan for combating the rise in violence that we've seen across the state. And one of the things that he and his administration are doing is investing in intervention. And they have targeted 15 cities, including Memphis is one of them, to provide additional funding for these intervention programs, which is great. It is great to see a leader understand the value of these programs and be willing to make that critical investment. Another policy that works is doing more to keep guns out of the hands of domestic violence abusers. Strengthening third-party dispossession, as we talked about earlier, would be key to that, as would be prohibiting transfer of guns to felons and abusers. I mean, again, these are pretty simple and low-hanging fruit type policies. Prioritizing suicide prevention. As we discussed, that is an ongoing problem in our state. The number of suicides is staggering. So we would support, you know, passage of extreme risk protection orders or ERPOs, which are key to preventing suicide, but then also just across the board, doing more to provide funding for crisis support systems for all types of suicide prevention. And then child access prevention. Tennessee has a disturbing number of cases every year where a young person, oftentimes a toddler, is able to easily gain access to an irresponsibly stored gun and shoot themselves or someone else with it. So we passed or we introduced legislation several years ago called Michaela's Law to address this. And really, we just need to hold adult gun owners responsible. The most important job, I always say, the most important job a gun owner has is making sure that their guns do not fall into the wrong hands, including the hands of curious kids. And then finally, at the end of the day, whether you're talking about gun violence or any other of many important initiatives, it matters who governs. So when it comes to addressing the issues we have in our state with gun violence, the most important things that you can do are to work hard to elect legislators who are not terrified of the NRA, to elect legislators who are not afraid of their radical base. And really what that means is we have to do more to elect Democrats. That's really our only way out of this problem. So that is, that's it.
But it looked like to me, there are so many ways to, um, there's so many ways we can solve these issues without even remotely beginning to infringe on someone's Second Amendment right. I mean, because that's what they preach, but some of these you wouldn't even be taking away anything.
Right. And really what you're doing with a lot of these, especially related to the domestic violence stuff, those are already people who are prohibited from having guns. I mean, you're basically just trying to do a better job and make it easier to enforce laws that are already there. And then, obviously the funding for intervention, I mean, that has nothing to do with gun rights or gun ownership. And really, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because what we deal with a lot, and I mean, really, you see it in a lot of policy areas, but it seems especially evident in firearm policy, which is what I call the straw man argument. Right. I mean, you say something like, we need to do more to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. And then if a legislator introduces that, it gets turned into this legislator, this senator is trying to take your guns away from you. And we saw that. I mean, honestly, that's what happened with the third party dispossession bill that we had a couple of years ago. It got spun into something that it absolutely was not, because they just put the straw man argument up because they don't have a good argument, a real argument to combat that. But yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, the issues that we just discussed, none of those would prevent a person who is not prohibited from having guns to go legally purchase a gun, get some training on it, and store it responsibly. Like, I don't even have a problem with that. As somebody who's worked in this space for years, I don't have a problem with responsible gun owners who take that responsibility seriously.
Right. I don't understand the thinking of, I'm just going to leave my gun laying in the seat of the car. I don't understand why you would even think that's okay.
It's ridiculous.
Anyway,
And, we hear all the time about responsible law abiding gun owners. And, my comeback there is, if you are leaving a loaded gun in the cup holder of your unlocked car, you are neither responsible nor law abiding.
mhm,
And it's really kind of like, there's a thing in the law called an attractive nuisance, which basically says, like, if you have a swimming pool, you're required by law to put a fence around it, because even though people shouldn't trespass into your property, it is an
right.
attractive nuisance. A child is likely to walk up to that pool and potentially fall in and drown. And to me, I sort of see guns and cars as an attractive nuisance. Yes, obviously, nobody should be stealing guns out of cars, but when you make it easy for them to do so, it's going to happen. With that permitless carry, part of the way they try to make permitless carry more palatable is they added all these sentence enhancements for people who steal guns out of cars, which was ridiculous to me. I mean, sure, throw people in jail for longer if that's what you feel like you need to do if they steal a gun. But if you think there are that many 14, 15, 16-year-old kids that have any understanding about what the sentence enhancements are for stealing a gun out of a car, I mean, that's nuts. Like, we should be doing more to try and prevent it from happening instead of trying to punish, enact stronger punishments for people after it happens. Like, let's prevent it from happening in the first place. In other words, if we know how to prevent cancer, let's concentrate on how we can prevent cancer rather than spending all of our time and energy just looking at cancer treatments.
Right. It's like our healthcare. Tennessee is so just, I don't know what they're thinking, because it's like our health, we treat the disease. We don't try to prevent it. I mean, we are
Exactly.
so backwards in that way of thinking. When I was little, I was in our bedroom. My mother was folding clothes. I was like 3 or 4 years old. And she turned around and I had my father's gun in my hand, pointed right at her. I was 3, I was little. And I said, bang, bang, mommy. And she said, she almost like fell out and fainted. And she kind of talked it away from me. But that is just how easy, I could have, had that gun go off.
And
And
that happens all the time. And
yeah,
we talk a lot about sort of the secondary trauma when that does happen, because what we have seen is in that situation, let's say, God forbid, you shot your mother and killed
right.
her. How old did you say you were?
I was 3 or 4. I mean, I
3 or
wasn't in
4.
school. I was tiny.
So can you imagine living the rest of your life with the knowledge that you killed your own mother, right? I
Right.
mean, that's horrible. And, we see this often with siblings where, like, 5 or 6-year-old kids playing with a gun and they unintentionally shoot and kill like their 3 or 4-year-old brother or sister. And, not to be graphic, but the visual trauma of seeing that happen, you can't unsee that. And then the psychological damage that goes along with knowing that you were the cause of that. There've been not any formal research done, but I've read several accounts of where, they followed up with some of these folks into adulthood, and, they have substance abuse issues, they have trouble staying in relationships. I mean, they have all this unresolved trauma. And it's so frustrating because in that situation, all of that could have been prevented if
Mhm.
the gun owner had just stored their gun responsibly. It's really, like I said, the most important job you have as a gun owner is making sure that your gun doesn't fall into the wrong hands, be it the hands of a thief who opens up your car door, or be it the hands of your child or a child that's visiting your house, that finds a gun, just on top of a table or in a dresser drawer.
Yeah, I know people that don't think they should have to do any of that. That they have no responsibility. It's their right to have that gun, and they can have it wherever, whenever they like. And I don't get that.
I don't get that either, and it's very frustrating. And what's really frustrating is I feel like those people tend to be very loud and very opinionated. Um, and what is frustrating about all of that is that truly the vast majority of gun owners in this country and in this state are responsible. They would never in a million years dream of leaving a gun laying around.
Mhm.
Would never dream of leaving their gun just laying around in their car. The vast majority of gun owners nationwide and even here in Tennessee, they support sensible gun laws. Like, they're on board with that. Um, it's the loud, irresponsible ones, though, that get all of the attention, and they like to sort of lump all gun owners under their umbrella, which is frustrating. And, I'm always heartened when I deal with responsible gun owners who are not afraid to be outspoken and to speak in opposition to those gun owners who are irresponsible.
Right. Last thing, do you have any what are your resources to keep up with these numbers? What websites or links do you like to go to? To
Well,
keep
that's
things
a
warm?
that's a a tough question because I used to do all of this for the Safe Tennessee Project, which was the organization that I ran. Um, I started the organization because there literally was no one else doing that. There were other advocacy groups out there, and advocacy groups do great work and, trying to mobilize people to make phone calls and send emails and all that's great. But you really need the hard numbers, you need the hard data. So I don't know that I necessarily have a great resource for you in terms of keeping up with the statistics. Now, what I will say is that through all of the work that I have done over the years, now that I am in the General Assembly and now that I work on policy issues, I can't quit guns, right? Like that's always going to be an area of policy focus for me. So even though there might not be a website that I can direct you to, I can tell you that if you follow Democrats in the legislature, especially in the Senate where I work, I always include this kind of anytime I put together a policy brief for our members up here, I always include these data and statistics because it's not all that easy to find. Like I get all the information from the CDC, right? Which means I have to go to a database. I have to know exactly how to enter the right information in that database and export it and then sort it. And it's a whole rigmarole to do it. But like I said, we will continue to talk about it up here in the General Assembly. The Democrats up here will continue to push back against the extremist, dangerous legislation that's being pushed, while at the same time trying to advocate for the types of laws that are favored by the majority of Tennesseans, and that will take important steps towards trying to keep our communities safer. And really, as much as possible, I would just encourage folks. There's a tendency, obviously, to in advocacy to mostly just reach out to folks who have legislation that you oppose, and that's important. But I always tell people, don't ever forget the importance of reaching out to folks that are on your side on issues. And number one, thanking them when they do the right thing on legislation, but also encouraging them to file legislation to support important policies. Because when they get a lot of people calling them up saying, "Listen, you guys have to do more about funding these interventions. Why they're doing this in Memphis? How do we get that in Nashville?" You kind of plant those bugs, you plant those seeds, and oftentimes that's how legislation ends up being filed. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out, even to the best Democrats that and ask them to take a stand on a lot of these issues.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time. You are on it. You've got some great slides and great information. And like I said, the biggest thing I got out of this is that we can do things without infringing on the Second Amendment. So
Yes.
very good to know. We need to keep all that together. We need to thank our representatives. So thanks for everything. And
My pleasure.
get this out and let everybody see it and have a great day.
Thanks so much, Lee.
All right. Bye, Beth.